going to talk to him about number 6 and number 160 right off the bat when they come in.
And we're going to do the autopsy argument now too, so we don't have to go out.
Yep. All right, we are on the record. We have counsel and Mr. Jackson present. We are outside the presence of the jury to make a record on a couple things. First, over the lunch hour, I did have a chance to review the demonstrative exhibit related to the aforementioned YouTube video. And this is the some video of the firearm at issue and kind of how it works and whatnot. And after viewing that video, I agreed with Mr. Johnston that some of it is not really relevant and goes perhaps beyond demonstrative purposes. So I've got, in discussion with counsel, I've got timestamp start at 150 of that, end at 325, and then start at 452 and end at about 520. And then that's it. My understanding, we all kind of looked at the video together in chambers with Mr. Jackson there. Mr. Johnson, you don't have any issue with the times. You're still objecting to the voiceover, is that correct?
Yes.
All right. So that objection is noted, but I am going to allow the state to play that for demonstrative purposes with those noted timestamps. We also talked about the need for the state to provide a copy of the demonstrative exhibit, which will be admitted as Court Exhibit 1. And related to that, we talked about the other demonstrative exhibit that's been used quite a bit, that being the map. It's my understanding that the parties have agreed to actually submit that as an exhibit so the jury would have it available to them and that it would be admitted as State's Exhibit 160. And I'll inform the jury of that when we begin our resume with them after the lunch hour. Is that correct on the state's end?
Yes, Judge.
All right, and I am going to remind both of you just to turn on your mics when you're speaking. It helps with the people who may be viewing. So, Mr. Johnson, is that correct on your end as far as the map?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Then, lastly, I think after Mr. Officer Investigator Dunbar testifies, my understanding is the next witness that the state plans on calling is the medical examiner, and I was alerted to an objection by the state. The state has, I believe, has 40, I believe, total autopsy photos for the 3 decedents in this case. And so, Mr. Johnson, you indicated you objected to those videos. I'll let you make, or excuse me, those photos. I'll let you make your objection on the record.
Thank you, Your Honor. As Your Honor knows, we had a number of jurors who talked in voir dire about reacting negatively to photos of dead people. I didn't even get to autopsy photos or mention those to the jury, which is my fault. But I don't think we need to make it worse by putting in 40 separate photos when the nature of this crime is not at issue. It's who did this crime. There's plenty of evidence in the record. The state doesn't have a need for photographs of the injuries from the autopsy. There's going to be very little questioning of that witness by us. The injuries to these people are obvious and multiple. There's no doubt about premeditation. There's no doubt about malice. It's whoever killed these people did so with the intent to kill them based on the multiple rounds that were fired and based upon the fact that there would have been plenty of time to premeditate going from room to room. So we don't believe that autopsy photos, the state does not have a need for the autopsy photos. They're more prejudicial than probative for that reason, and we would object to all 40 of them.
Ms. Slaughter, Mr. Scheer, who wants to address this from the state's end? Ms. Slaughter?
40 autopsy photos for 3 different dead bodies is minimal, Your Honor. The photos were selected very strategically to avoid gore. They walk from the moment that the body bag with the deceased remains inside of them arrives at the MEs to what is in the body bags at the time that the seal is broken and confirms the toe tag to the bag tag. The rest of them are what are considered clean photographs. They take place after the bodies have been washed. They're not overly gruesome, for lack of a better word, Your Honor, and I don't see any reason why they would not be admitted. Further, regardless of the defense contention that this is a murder and we're just here debating on who committed the crime, the state still has elements of each crime to prove. And some of those are proven through the, frankly, viciousness and calculatedness of these wounds to each of the deceased bodies. And therefore, we're asking that the ones that were submitted as proposed exhibits be permitted by the court.
And
Go ahead.
viciousness is exactly what we're talking about. Viciousness isn't an element of the offense. And it's the viciousness that the state wants to get out by these photos. And it shows that they're meant to inflame the passions of the jury. And again, that's why we're objecting to those photographs.
Ms. Slaughter, you look like you have something more to say.
Viciousness, maliciousness, same thing. It's synonymous, Your Honor.
All right. Again, over the noon hour, I went back. I had looked at them already, but went back and looked at the autopsy photos. I would agree that, I guess, nobody can ever say autopsy photos are pleasant to look at or not gory or not troubling, but in the scheme of autopsy photos that I've seen, these are not as bad as some I've seen. I would agree. A lot of them, in fact, are frankly just pictures of bullets that I presume were found, clothes, tags, the pictures of the wounds, and are not overly gory, as Ms. Slaughter said. I do agree that the state has to prove certain things in this case, and they have to prove cause of death, they have to prove malice aforethought, and they're entitled to do so by presenting their case. And so for those reasons and the reasons articulated by Ms. Slaughter, I'm not going to sustain any objection to the autopsy photos based on the grounds raised by Mr. Johnston at this point are overruled. So with that, are we ready to bring in the jury, Ms. Slaughter?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Johnston?
Your Honor, first of all, may I have a standing objection to the autopsy photos? I plan on lodging my first objection, but I don't want to have to keep making it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've definitively ruled on the grounds you've raised. So with respect to the ground you've raised about respect to the autopsy photo, I'll consider it a standing objection. I mean, I think I've definitively ruled on it, and there'd be no need to object to every single photo based on that ground.
Thank you, Your Honor. Also, I just want the record to reflect we did have a discussion in chambers about Investigator Dunbar's testimony, in that if the state plans to get into any hearsay statements made to Investigator Dunbar about the relationship between the Jacksons, that they would approach the bench first before they ask that question, as per the court's previous ruling.
Right. That was already ruled on, the motion limine. I trust the state has read that and will comply with it, and you alerted them to that again in chambers. So, all right, with that, are you good to bring in the jury, Mr. Johnson?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right.
Is Dunbar in here? Can we bring Dunbar back up to the stand?
Yeah. Investigator Dunbar, you can come on up, have a seat. about number 6 as well. Yep. All right, you can go ahead and be seated. Hope everybody had a good lunch break. You may remember we were still, I think, with direct examination of Investigator Dunbar by Ms. Slaughter. Before we resume with that, a couple what I will refer to as housekeeping matters that I want to update you on. First, you've seen a lot of a map so far. Originally, that was not going to be admitted as an exhibit. The parties have now agreed that it makes sense for that to be an exhibit in this case. So I will admit by agreement the map as State's Exhibit 160 and just confirm, Ms. Slaughter, that's acceptable to the state?
It is, Your Honor.
Mr. Johnson, is that acceptable to Mr. Jackson?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. And then, so from now on, we will hopefully remember to refer to the map as Exhibit 160. And again, just for your reference purposes, that will be available to you as Exhibit 160 when you begin your deliberations. The other housekeeping matter you may remember several days ago now, but there was an exhibit number, I believe, 6, and this is the camera video from the Yang residence that was admitted, and I think I said it was admitted subject to there was a bench conversation that occurred. Just for your information, any of the issues that were addressed in the bench conversation have been resolved, and Exhibit 6 is admitted as submitted, and just in case you had any questions or were wondering about that. So no further issues with Exhibit 6, and it's admitted without any reservations, objections, or qualifications at all at this point. So with that, I think we're ready to resume with Investigator Dunbar. And Investigator Dunbar, even though we've had a break, I'm not going to swear you in. You're still on the stand. I'm just going to remind you, sir, that you are still under oath. And with that, Ms. Slaughter, you may resume your questioning.
Thank you, Your Honor. Investigator Dunbar, prior to us taking our lunch break, we were talking about you being at the Yang's residence. Is that correct?
Yes.
Your Honor, may I have the map back up, and I do not need the lights dimmed?
And you're referring to Exhibit 160?
160, and my apologies, Your Honor.
All right, should be up.
Thank you. After leaving the Yang residence, did you continue your canvassing efforts?
I did.
And what house did you go to next?
The next house I went to was the Downey residence.
And when you say the Downey residence, who lived there?
Luis and Edwin Downey.
And do you recall the address at that house?
I believe it was 4330 Oakleaf Court.
Is that house visible on the map shown in Exhibit 160?
It is.
Can you use that laser pointer again and show us which house belonged to the Downeys?
I believe it is that one right there.
And I'm going to do it on the television just because it's a little clearer. But from my understanding of what you just pointed at with that laser pointer, you were pointing to the house to the south of 4414?
Correct.
The house that I'm circling with my cursor, is that the house that you pointed to on the big screen?
Yes.
When you went to that address, was there something about that house that drew your attention to it for canvassing purposes?
There was a video camera system on the front of the house that I could see from the street.
When you went to the Downey's house, did you make contact with the residents?
I did.
And in speaking with the residents, did you mention to them the cameras?
Yes.
During your canvass at the Downey residence, did you receive information related to the directionality of those cameras.
Yes.
And how many cameras were there?
2.
Where was the second one located?
On the back, I believe pointed towards the porch.
So the rear camera at the Downey's residence pointed towards their porch?
Correct.
And where did the front camera point towards?
Downwards towards the front porch.
Was there anything else that either of the Downeys saw on June 15th of 2021 that had, that you felt had any investigatory value?
Response?
Not being offered for the truth of the matter asserted, Your Honor.
The objection's overruled. You can answer the question.
No.
After you canvassed at the Downey's house, did you continue your canvassing efforts?
Yes.
And was there another house that you went to during your canvassing?
Yes.
And can you tell us what the address of that house was?
I believe it was 5,000 Spring Oak Court.
Using the cursor again, can you show us on the big screen which house that was?
Yes. I believe it was that one right there.
And so, me using my mouse, would this be the first house at the northwest corner of Oakleaf Court northeast and Spring Oak Court northeast?
Correct.
What about that house, investigator, drew your attention to it or made you want to stop there to canvass?
They also had a camera on the front area of the house.
And how many cameras in total were located at that house?
They stated they had 2 cameras.
Whose house was that?
It was, I believe, a Christopher and Anita Hansen.
Did you collect any of the security cameras or security footage from that address?
No.
Why?
Due to the location of the house and the footage that we already collected from the Yang residence, at the time I didn't feel it evidentiary or valuable to collect that footage right there. Additionally, Christopher Hansen mentioned that
I don't have any objection, Your Honor. I don't think that the remainder of that answer was responsive to my question.
All right, the objection is sustained. Go ahead and ask your next question, Ms. Slaughter.
Thank you. Investigator Dunbar, when speaking with the Hansens, did you ask them if they had seen anything out of the ordinary on June 15th of 2021?
I did.
Well, the objection's overruled.
Did you ask them,
Yes, sorry.
and had they seen anything that they considered out of the ordinary?
Objection's overruled.
No.
Did your canvassing efforts continue after that?
Yes.
And was there another house on Spring Oak Court Northeast that you stopped at?
Yes.
And which house was that?
I believe it was 5001 Spring Oak Court.
Maybe 5101?
That sounds correct, yes.
Okay.
It was directly across the street.
And when you say directly across the street, are we talking the southwest corner?
Yes.
Is this the house, and when I say southwest corner, I apologize, southwest corner of Spring Oak Court Northeast and Oakleaf Court Northeast intersection?
Yes, that's the house.
What about that house made you stop there?
It was right across the street from the Hansens, and it was nearby.
Were there any cameras on that house?
No.
Did you speak with the homeowners at that address?
Yes.
Did they see anything out of the ordinary that morning?
Overruled.
No.
What'd you do, investigator, after you went to the 5101 Spring Oak Court Northeast address?
I believe we completed our canvass for that day.
Did that conclude your involvement in this case?
No.
What else did you do?
The following day, Investigator DeMoss and myself were instructed to go back out to 4414 Oakleaf Court and conduct an additional canvass around the household and in the wooded area.
And when you say you were instructed, who were you instructed by?
Commanders in this investigative division, Lieutenant Dave Dostal and I believe Lieutenant Josh McAlpin.
Were you given specific instructions on what additional canvassing they wanted you to complete?
Yes, they wanted Investigator DeMoss and myself to focus our canvass in the wooded area to the north and east of the residence due to the defendant claiming that the suspect had exited the house and that was a possible path of travel.
Looking at a zoomed-in image of Exhibit 160, the map, as we've previously been calling it, can you use your, will you actually, ma'am, will you dim it just a little bit for me, please? Investigator, I'm going to have you come down from the witness stand, please, and use the television instead of the big screen. Can you point out for us what specific areas of the wooded area that you're referring to you performed a canvass in?
Yes, so Investigator DeMoss and myself focused just northeast of the residence and out into this wooded area.
How far to the west of the house did you go in the wooded area?
I roughly got to parallel to the house on Investigator Road, where it became fairly thick and travel.
And so when you say where it became thick and difficult to travel in, are you meaning it was thick and difficult to travel further to the west?
I was attempting to go all the way up to Investigator Road. There was a lot of down trees and underbrush, so I was unable to get to Investigator Road as I was doing my canvas. So probably due to duration damage.
Can you say that again?
Yes, sorry. I traveled to the north to Ushers Ferry Road and up until about right here, I couldn't get past any farther to get to Ushers Ferry Road.
Thank you. If you can have a seat, please.
Ms. Slaughter, are you done with Exhibit 160 for the time being?
For now, yes, Your Honor.
All right.
When you say due to derecho damage, those of us who were here for the derecho know what that means, but can you describe what you saw in the woods that was preventing you from getting through the woods to Usher Ferry?
As I previously stated, there were down trees, thick brush. It was so thick that I couldn't get any farther north to Ushers Ferry Road like I wanted to. So I took my vehicle and I drove around to Ushers Ferry Road and then canvassed back southward. While I did so, I had to climb over several trees, almost like a balancing act on one of the tree limbs just to get back southwards towards the residence.
So when you got back in your car, you drove around to Usher Ferry Road.
Correct.
And when you say you continued your canvassing efforts, you came in at the top side of that wooded area and worked your way towards the house?
Correct.
Were you able to get through the downed trees and the brush to get back into the backyard area of 4414?
Yes, but it was difficult.
You said you had to climb over some trees,
Yes.
touched a lot of things,
Yes.
damage your clothes at all?
I don't know if I damaged my clothes, but they were very dirty.
Very dirty?
Yes.
Did you make any canvassing efforts at the homes on Usher Ferry Road?
Yes. When I was done canvassing southwards back towards the residence, I re-entered my vehicle and I went, I guess technically north and south on Ushers Ferry Road, all the way to Blair's Ferry looking for additional camera systems.
Was there anywhere that you stopped on Usher Ferry Road?
Yes.
And is that location where you stopped visible on the map shown in Exhibit 160?
Yes.
May I have that back, Your Honor?
You may.
Can you see the house on the big screen?
Yes, I believe it was that one right there.
And what made you stop at that house?
They had a video system on the front area of the house. I don't remember exactly where.
Were you ever able to make contact with the occupants or residents of that home?
I don't recall for sure. I think they contacted me at a later date and said the camera.
Objection, Your Honor, calls for hearsay. And may we approach?
You may. All right, the objection is overruled. Investigator Dunbar, if you remember, you can finish your answer.
Okay. I don't recall if they contacted me.
Did you ever collect any video from that household?
No.
While you were canvassing the wooded area between the backyard at the Jackson home and Usher's Ferry Road, was there anything of evidentiary value that you found?
No.
Nothing further for this witness, Your Honor.
Mr. Johnson, cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, investigator.
Good afternoon.
You, as a police officer, are trained in making reports, correct?
Correct.
You're told that you can write all you want in a report, right?
Yes.
There's no page limit.
Correct.
There's no word limit.
Correct.
And if you see something of importance, you put it in your report.
Correct.
And if you hear something of importance, you put that in your report.
Correct.
And you would agree that people who didn't see anything that morning would be important, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And yet, in your entire report about the canvassing that you did not once mention that any of these people said they didn't see anything that day, did you?
I'd have to see my report.
Your Honor, may I approach?
You may.
No, you're right.
Have you had a chance to look at that?
I believe so.
And did you put in there, in any of those conversations, that any of those people told you that they didn't see anything that day?
I believe the Yangs did.
So you did put it in for the Yang. You're saying it's in your report that the Yang said they didn't see anything?
I thought they said they didn't hear or see anything. Maybe I misread that.
You said the Young stated that this was not abnormal and they did not notice anything out of the ordinary. But there's nothing in here about them not seeing anything that day. Oh, wait. You said they had not heard anything this morning. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, that's what I saw.
Okay, so when somebody tells you that they didn't see anything that morning, you knew how to write it down, right?
Correct.
And you put it in your report.
Correct.
So when the Yangs told you they didn't see or hear anything that morning, you wrote that down.
Yes.
And yet you didn't write it down for anybody else, correct?
I did not see that. Correct.
You didn't write it down for the Downies, right?
Correct.
You didn't write it down for Mr. Hansen,
Correct.
and you didn't write it down for Mr. Choi.
Correct.
And of course, you wrote nothing down on the 4461 Usher's Ferry because they never got back to you.
Yeah, they didn't answer the door either.
So basically, you didn't ask them,
I would have asked them.
and you would have put it in your report if you had.
If they saw something abnormal or out of the ordinary, I would have documented that.
Now, turning your attention to Mr. Hansen, I believe you testified that that was 5,000 Spring or Oak Court Northeast. Could that have been 5,100?
I could have gotten the address wrong.
Would you rely on your report as opposed to what you testified to?
If I could see my report, yes, I'd go off that.
You take my word for it. It says, it's no big deal. I don't care that you got the address wrong.
I'll take your word for it.
Okay, all right, that's fine. And, but you did have a conversation with Mr. Hansen at that residence, did you not?
Yes, it was relatively brief, but yes.
And he said he had 2 cameras. You testified about that.
Yes.
But he did not believe any of them pointed towards the area of 4414 Oak Leaf Court.
Correct.
And that's why you didn't collect any video from that camera.
I apologize. It was my belief that maybe the backyard camera might point that direction, but due to the video I saw at the Yang's residence, which covered all of Oakleaf Court and I think Scarlet Sage Drive, I didn't find it important at that time to stop for an extended period of time to gather that video right then.
I'm saying you didn't gather any video from his house, did you?
No, I did not.
And it would have, he said he did not believe any of them pointed towards the area of 4414 Oak Leaf Court.
Okay.
That's what you wrote, right? Do you want to see it?
That's okay, I believe you.
So that's why you didn't collect it, because it wouldn't have been pointed in the right direction.
It would have been pointed northbound or northwards, and there was a wooded area behind the Hanson's house, so I probably was thinking that it didn't capture anything.
Okay, thank you. And then with respect to 5101 Spring Oak Court that you've testified to, Mr. Choi told you he didn't have any cameras.
Correct.
Again, nothing in there about asking him whether he saw anything or not. There's nothing in your report about that, is there?
If he saw something, I would have documented it.
So as I understand your testimony about the next day, you're saying that you couldn't get through the woods in your initial effort when you were going towards Usher's Ferry Road from the Jackson house.
Correct.
But you could get to the Jackson house when you went south from Usher's Ferry Road back towards the Jackson's house. You were able to make it all the way.
Yeah, excuse me. I had to go up the embankment, and there was a downed tree that I was able to hop up on and cross over so I could get through the heavy shrubbery and trees.
So maybe you just went through a different way on the way back than you went on the way out.
I tried to position my vehicle right where I had ended my initial canvas northbound, so I tried to make it about the same area. I
understand, but maybe you didn't take exactly the same path.
Possibly.
And also maybe you were trying a little harder.
Okay.
Well, I'm just asking you, is that possible that you just made a greater effort on the way back?
I feel like if I could have got to Usher's Ferry Road, I would have.
Well, I mean, is there any reason why you could only make it one way and not the other way?
Because of the downed trees and shrubbery.
Right, but I'm just saying, what difference does it make which approach you use?
Well, it was uphill to get to Usher's Ferry Road, and when I was coming back, it was downhill, so it was a little bit easier to get over the downed trees.
It was a little bit easier?
Yes.
Okay. I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Any redirect, Ms. Slaughter?
Just briefly, Your Honor. Investigator Dunbar, when you stopped at all of these residences during your canvassing efforts and made contact with the homeowners, would it be fair to say you asked several questions?
Yes,
And some of the answers to those questions were documented in your reports,
I'm
correct?
leading, Your Honor.
Overruled, you can answer the question.
yes,
At the end of your contact and or communication with the residents of these houses that you canvassed at, did you provide them a business card?
all of them.
And when you provided the business card, did you tell them, if you can think of anything else or remember anything out of the ordinary that comes to mind later, call me
Yes, and I circle my email and phone number.
on the business card?
Yes,
And so is it your testimony today, Investigator Dunbar, as you sit there, that you asked all of the people that you canvassed at whether or not they had seen anything out of the ordinary?
yes,
And asked them if they remember something out of the ordinary later, give me a call?
yes,
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Mr. Johnson, anything further?
Again, you were able to write that down when you talked about the Yangs, and you put it in your report that they didn't see anything out of the ordinary, correct?
correct.
You didn't for anybody else in your report, did you?
No,
You knew how to write it, right?
correct.
You had the time to write it, right?
Yes,
It was important information, was it not?
yes,
And you didn't put it in your report.
I did not.
No further questions.
Ms. Slaughter?
Investigator Dunbar, you did put in your report, and I quote, "Each household I stopped at, I provided my business card and told them to contact me," you wrote him, not them, "told him to contact me if anything out of the ordinary would come to mind at a later date," correct?
Correct.
Nothing further.
Making sure. You got another question, Mr. Johnson?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Investigator Dunbar, you may step down, and I believe you are free to leave.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Ms. Slaughter, is the state prepared to call its next witness?
State calls Kelly Cruz to the stand, Your Honor.
All right, and ladies and gentlemen, while Ms. Cruz is coming up here after lunch, I know everybody maybe feel a little tired. Why don't you just stand and stretch real quick? I'm going to do the same. All right. Cruz, you want to just have a seat, please? And is it Dr. Cruz?
Yes.
Yeah, we'll swear you in if you raise your right hand. Dr. Cruz, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you'll be giving today will be the truth?
I do.
All right, and you can put your hand down. And just for the record, please, can you give me your first name and your last name and spell them both?
My name is Kelly Cruz, Kelly Kruse.
Ms. Slaughter?
Thank you. Dr. Cruz, how are you currently employed?
I am an associate state medical examiner at the Iowa Office of the State Medical Examiner.
Can you tell us a little bit about, or a lot, about your educational background that qualifies you for that position?
So after I graduated from high school, I attended Tulane University and earned a Bachelor of Science in Anthropology. I then attended St. George's University, where I earned a Master of Public Health. I then stayed at their medical school and earned a Doctor of Medicine degree. After I graduated from that in 2013, I then entered an anatomic and clinical pathology residency program. That was at a hospital in New Jersey. When I graduated from that in 2017, I completed a forensic pathology fellowship program, and that was at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner of Maryland. After I graduated from that program, I became employed by the office here in Iowa.
Dr. Cruz, you used the word fellowship when describing some of your educational background. Can you explain to us what a fellowship is or what it means to be a fellow?
Sure. So once someone graduates from medical school, they enter a residency, and that's where you learn about specialties within medicine. If you want to specialize even further, then you complete a fellowship. So my residency was in pathology, and my fellowship was in forensic pathology.
You were also the chief resident, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us what that means?
There are usually a number of residents, so within each of the 4 years at my program, there were 4 to 5 residents. Once you become a 4th year, 1 or 2 people are picked to be in charge, essentially, of all the residents in their training.
And you described a specified study or practice being pathology. Can you explain to us what pathology is?
Pathology is the study of disease, disease processes, and how those affect the human body.
So what is the difference between pathology in general versus the forensic pathology that you did your fellowship in?
Forensic pathology takes those disease processes, they look at them, and then also adds an injury and how disease and injury affect the human body and ultimately lead to someone's death.
Anatomic and clinical pathology, does that also differ from forensic pathology?
Forensic pathology is usually found within anatomic pathology.
So what is anatomic then?
So pathology can be broken up into those 2 different main groups. There's anatomic pathology and clinical pathology. Anatomic really deals with kind of whole people, whole organs. So we get specimens from the operating room, we'll look at them with the naked eye, then we'll look at them under the microscope, really with the purpose of diagnosing any sort of natural disease like cancer. And then clinical pathology looks more like a cellular level. They deal with blood banking, microbiology, virology, and the big one being chemistry in the hospital.
What, if any, licensures or certificates do you hold?
So I am board certified in anatomic pathology, clinical pathology, and forensic pathology, and I also have a license to practice medicine in Iowa.
As an associate state medical examiner, can you tell us what are your primary job responsibilities?
Really, my number 1 responsibility at the office is to perform autopsies, write an autopsy report, and then determine cause and manner of death. Once I've determined cause and manner of death, I'm then required to sign a death certificate. Other duties that I have, I provide expert testimony on my cases, I talk to family members, I review medical records, toxicology reports, talk to law enforcement, gather evidence throughout the autopsy process and things along those lines. We also do a lot of teaching in our office to medical students.
Since you've been working as an associate state medical examiner, do you know approximately how many autopsies you've completed?
Since I've been working at the state medical examiner's office, I've performed about 1,000 autopsies and about 1,400 to 1,500 total throughout all of my training.
When you perform an autopsy, is there an industry standard or specific protocols that you as a medical examiner follow in each autopsy that you do?
I do. So we are accredited under the National Association of Medical Examiners. They provide guidelines on how to perform an autopsy, and then using those guidelines, we also have standard operating procedures in our office. So really, no matter what kind of a case it may be, we essentially perform each autopsy the exact same way.
Can you tell us generally what way that is that the autopsies are performed?
Each autopsy can really be broken up into 2 parts. We have our external examination and the internal examination. The external examination starts from the beginning when the body is removed from the cooler where it has been placed waiting for the autopsy. There the body will be weighed, measured in length. Anything on the outside of the body will be documented. So if there's clothing, medical therapy, jewelry, that will be documented, then removed. Then the body is washed, and then we do a head-to-toe examination of the body, looking at defining characteristics like hair color, eye color, tattoos. We're looking for any sort of natural disease, say someone has surgical scars, and then looking for any evidence of injury. All of that is photographed and documented. Once that external examination is complete, then we perform the internal examination. That begins with collection of specimens. So we collect blood, vitreous fluid from the eyes, and then urine if it's available, really for the purpose of toxicology testing. Then we make a Y sort of incision. All of the organs are then removed. They're each weighed, and then I look at each one for any evidence of disease or injury. That includes all the chest organs, the abdominal organs, and the brain as well. Once that is complete and everything's documented, the organs are put back into the body. It is sewn back up and sent to a funeral home.
When autopsies are performed, do you do those by yourself or do you do it with a team?
We have a team at our office. We perform multiple autopsies at any given period of time, and we make use of autopsy technicians. So they're the ones who procure those specimens, take out the organs, weigh them for me. They'll measure the body, weigh it, and really help with anything else that we need, like picture taking.
I'm assuming, are there more than one associate state medical examiner?
Yes.
Can you tell us how cases are assigned for autopsy when bodies come into the medical examiner's office?
We receive bodies from almost the entire state. So we perform autopsies on individuals who die in 97 of the 99 counties in Iowa. So we have a log of when people come in, and based on availability, how difficult a case may be, we then make a schedule for the next day. The pathologist who performs the autopsies does so based on a schedule, and we receive a monthly schedule where we all rotate.
Were you assigned as the associate medical examiner to perform autopsies on the body of Jan, Melissa, and Sabrina Jackson?
Yes.
Can you break down for us, well, strike that please. Each one of these autopsies that you did on the three people I just mentioned, were those done separately?
2 were done on the same day, and then 1 was done the following day.
One is started and completed before you start and complete another one?
They're usually done concurrently.
Speaking specifically first, Dr. Cruz, about the autopsy performed on Jan Jackson, can you walk us through the autopsy that you performed on him?
Sure. So his autopsy was performed in the same standard way that we perform all autopsies. So the body was removed from the cooler, it was weighed, measured, and then documented for medical therapy, clothing. He had bags on his hands. Those were all documented and removed. And his clothing was also photographed separately. Once all that was documented and removed, his body was cleaned, and then I was able to determine he had a total of 5 gunshot wounds. Each one of those gunshot wounds was photographed, measured, documented for any sort of evidence of close range discharge of a firearm. And then once that external examination portion was complete, I then performed my internal examination portion. So there I was able to determine which organs were injured from the gunshot wounds and any sort of associated findings with that. I was also able to look for any sort of natural disease that he may have, such as coronary artery disease, hypertension, fatty liver. But he didn't have any sort of natural disease that would have accounted for his death.
When a body is delivered to the state medical examiner's office, can you explain to us the manner in which that body is received?
Each body should be received in a body bag with very, very rare exceptions, and then with a lock on the zippers. That lock has a number, and it's photographed before we start the autopsy to show that that lock has not been broken, and that's just really for chain of custody purposes for any potential evidence.
The tag that you refer to on the outside of the body bag, is that the only tag associated with a body?
There's that lock with the number and then a tag with their name on it.
Is there a secondary tag on the body itself?
Oh, yes.
Okay, and should those match?
Yes.
Dr. Cruz, there is a binder in front of you. If you could please open that. I would like you to flip specifically and look at the photographs previously marked States Exhibit 7 through States Exhibit 26.
I'm sorry, was I supposed to go through all of them or
Through
just
26?
Just 26, okay.
Okay, you've had a chance to review those?
Yes,
Do you recognize the photos?
yes,
And are they photographs that you took?
yes,
Were they taken during the autopsy of Jan Jackson?
yes.
And the images depicted in these photographs, do they fairly and accurately represent your findings that were discovered during your autopsy?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move to have States Exhibits 7 through 26 admitted into evidence.
Any additional objections, Mr. Johnson?
No additional objections, Your Honor.
States Exhibits 7 through 26 are admitted.
May I have permission to publish those exhibits, Your Honor?
You may.
Dr. Cruz, looking first at States Exhibit 7, can you tell us what we are viewing in this photograph?
So these are the two sort of items on the outside of the bag. On the left-hand side is that lock with the number. The photograph showing the lock was intact when received. And then on the right is a tag with Jan Jackson's name.
There's also a ruler shown in this photograph, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you explain to us what the purpose of the rulers are in your photographs?
We have a ruler in every single photograph. The ruler has the case number, so that is our just state medical examiner's office number for organizational purposes, and then also for helping if you want to measure or determine how big or small something may be.
Looking next at States Exhibit 8, can you explain to us what we're looking at in this photograph?
This is what we would call an as-is photograph of Mr. Jackson as he was received. So this photograph was taken right after the bag was opened and nothing was moved.
Can you explain to us, Dr. Cruz, what is on Jan Jackson's hands?
Those are brown paper bags. We often have those covering the hands of many decedents, oftentimes when there are gunshot wounds or a concern for any potential trace evidence. Really, the purpose is to protect the hands during that transportation process and while they're sitting in the cooler.
Moving on to State's Exhibit 9, can you tell us what we're looking at in this photograph?
This is the identification tag that was on Mr. Jackson, bearing his name.
And did you form an opinion as to whether or not the tag on Mr. Jackson's person matched the tagging information that was on the outside of the body bag?
Yes, they matched.
State's Exhibit 9, can you explain to us what we're looking at here?
This is a photograph of Mr. Jackson's shirt after it had been removed.
I apologize, I was just made aware I referred to this as Exhibit 9. This is State's Exhibit 10. Okay. Is there a reason, Dr. Cruz, that the clothing of Jan Jackson was photographed in this case?
Yes.
Can you explain that to us, please?
There were holes in the shirt that corresponded to gunshot wounds that I had seen, and I wanted to have those documented.
In the photo that's showing in Exhibit 10, I'm using my cursor circling an area. Are you able from this photo, Dr. Cruz, to see a hole in this shirt?
Yes.
And the hole that I'm referring to, pretty center right below the collar of the shirt, is that a gunshot hole or a bullet hole?
Yes, there was a bullet wound that corresponded to that hole.
Are there any other defects from this vantage point in the shirt that you can see in this photograph?
No, I can't appreciate any others.
Moving then on to State Exhibit 11. Is this a zoomed in, bless you, photograph of the same shirt that we just saw in Exhibit 10?
Yes.
And in this zoomed in photo, are you now able to see any additional defects in the shirt?
Yes, there appears to be a second one right above the ruler.
And would that be above the first 0 in the ruler?
Yes.
Did the second one or second hole in the shirt that we're seeing in State's Exhibit 11, did that also correspond with an injury on Jan Jackson's body?
Yes.
Looking at State's Exhibit 12, can you explain to us, Dr. Cruz, what we're seeing in this photograph?
So this is the back of Mr. Jackson's head after I had shaved it so that I could better visualize 2 gunshot wounds.
In the report of autopsy that you wrote, you described gunshot wounds to the occipital scalp. Are these injuries in the occipital scalp?
Yes.
Are these the injuries that you referred to as being the right and left occipital scalp?
Yes.
Can you tell us what injury was sustained as a result of these 2 gunshot wounds?
For both gunshot wounds, the bullet entered into the skull. So there was injury to the scalp, the skull, the dura, which is a thin sort of membrane that covers the brain, and then injury to the brain as well with associated bleeding.
When you reference left and right occipital scalp, is it his left or from the vantage point that you would be looking at them from?
His left.
I've got a couple of these out of chronological order just to give some context, but moving next to State's Exhibit 14, can you tell us what we're looking at here?
This is the left side of the upper forehead. Here is another gunshot wound. The wound, the more rounded one on the left-hand side, is the entrance wound, and on the right-hand side is, looking at the photograph, is a partial exit wound. So part of the bullet broke off and exited, while the rest of the bullet entered into the skull.
And looking at 17, State's Exhibit 17, is this the same injury?
Yes.
Zoomed in.
Yes.
From this vantage point, the injury shown to the left side of the photograph, is that the entrance wound?
Here, so the entrance wound should be more of a rounded appearance. Let me just double check. It has a weirder look to it from that angle.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh. Yeah. The right side, the one on to the right, should be the entrance wound.
The
Yeah.
right side of the
The
photograph?
rounded, yes.
And the left side, I apologize, this more V-shaped wound would be the partial exit wound?
Yes, it's turned compared to the other one.
And State's Exhibit 13, same injury,
Yes,
zoomed in.
yes.
Is there any explanation medically why the entrance wound is more circular and the exit wound or partial exit wound, as you referred to it, is more of a V-shaped wound?
Usually when the bullet has a clear path from the gun to the person and hits the skin, it has a lot of energy. So it actually bores a hole into that skin. So there's part of the skin that's missing. Once that bullet hits something, it loses a lot of energy. So then when it goes to exit the body, it really sort of pokes through or lacerates the skin. And so you don't have that rounded appearance. You really shouldn't be missing any skin. And you can look at wounds and to determine if they're entrance and exit wounds by trying to put those edges of the wound together. So here on the right-hand side, it's very round. You wouldn't be able to get those edges together. But on the left-hand side, you can clearly see the edges of that wound come together.
Looking at State's Exhibit 15, can you tell us what we are seeing in this photograph?
This is Mr. Jackson's chest. So at the top, you can see part of his facial hair. That's where his head is, and his feet are at the bottom. And 2 gunshot wounds can be appreciated.
So I see an injury center just below his chin. Is that a gunshot wound?
Yes.
Dr. Cruz, there's some marking around the injury. Would that be fair to say?
Some sort of discoloration, yeah.
Can you give us any medical explanation for the discoloration around this wound?
So that blue, purple, red, purple sort of appearance is what I call ecchymosis. It's really just blood seeping into the soft tissue around that gunshot wound. In areas of your body where you have more blood vessels, you will see more ecchymosis. And here you have a lot of blood vessels in that region of the body.
And you said there was a second injury. In the bottom left-hand corner, there's a dark spot. Would that be the second injury that you're referring to?
Yes.
Is that also a gunshot wound?
Yes.
Looking at State's Exhibit 16, can you tell us what we're viewing in this photograph?
This is the top half of Mr. Jackson's body after it had been cleaned. Here we can see those 2 gunshot wounds, the one to the lower neck and one to the right side of the chest. And then we also see more of his face where we can appreciate some injuries there as well.
And how would you describe the injuries seen to the face of Mr. Jackson?
The injuries to the face are blunt force injuries. So the T-shaped injury is an abrasion or a scrape. He also has lacerations to his face on the right side of the nose, on the lips as well, and that's really just a tearing of the skin. And there's also bruising as well.
Could the injuries that you refer to as scraped and lacerations on Mr. Jan Jackson's face have been caused from falling?
Yes.
And then looking at State's Exhibit 18, what are we seeing here?
This is a close-up photograph of one of those lacerations on the inside of the lower lip.
And is it possible that these injuries to the lip would also have been as a result of falling?
It's possible, yes.
You're not suggesting in any way that these are bullet holes?
No, they're not.
State's Exhibit 19, there are words associated or on this photo. Can you tell us what that says, please?
It says fragment from left forehead.
And when you say fragment, is this a bullet fragment?
Yes.
And when you say left forehead, can you explain to us where specifically you found this bullet fragment?
This bullet fragment is from that gunshot wound on the left side of the upper forehead. It was within the soft tissue of one of the wounds.
And when you say within the soft tissue, would that be outside of the scalp or outside of the bone?
Correct, embedded within the scalp, essentially.
Thank you. And State's Exhibit 20, what are the words on State's Exhibit 20?
Right chest.
And on the right side of Mr. Jackson's body, that lower dark hole, is this fragment related to that hole?
For both of the wounds that were seen in that photograph, so the bullet to the lower neck and the bullet to the chest both entered into the chest cavity. These fragments are from the one of the lower neck, so the higher one that injured the right lung, and the bullet fragmented, and so within that cavity are where we found multiple bullet fragments.
And the words associated with State's Exhibit 21?
Left frontal bone.
And where is the left frontal bone?
It's really in the forehead region, so it would be associated with that bullet hole, the bullet holes on the left side of the forehead.
State's Exhibit 22, there are 5 very small pieces or fragments of a bullet. This says abdomen 1, is that correct?
Yes.
Where specifically were these fragments located?
These fragments were found within soft tissue in the organs of the abdomen. So that gunshot wound to the right side of the chest entered into the chest cavity, injured the lung, and then went into the abdominal cavity and injured the liver. So along the way, it left off little fragments, and along that wound path, specifically within the abdomen, I was able to recover these.
And then State's Exhibit 23, frontal lobe. What's the frontal lobe?
So the frontal lobe is part of the brain that is underneath that frontal lobe and the frontal bone and the frontal scalp, so really in the forehead region. And a projectile or a bullet was recovered from the frontal lobe associated with one of the gunshot wounds of the head.
And when you say of the head, are you referring to the occipital area, the back of the head?
Correct. So he ended up having 3 bullets recovered from the skull and the brain associated with all 3 gunshot wounds of the head.
And 24, can you read for us what that says?
Frontoparietal lobe. That's a part of the brain where each lobe isn't really clearly demarcated, so it's kind of where 2 of them meet. So not quite towards the exact front of the brain, but slightly back. Another projectile was recovered.
And did you associate that projectile from one of the shots in the back of the head as well?
Yes.
State's Exhibit 25, is this additional fragments?
Yes.
And were these located in the right chest per the words written on the photograph?
Correct. There was blood in the chest cavity, so that was collected and then sifted through to look for more bullet fragments.
And while sifting through the blood from the chest cavity, that's where these fragments were found?
Correct.
And 26.
So this is a projectile from the right side of the back. That bullet that entered into the chest cavity and then went into the abdomen was then lodged in the back, and it was recovered.
Dr. Cruz, during your examination of Jan Jackson, were you able to determine a specific time of death?
No.
Are there some fallacies associated with finding the time of death?
There are a lot of misconceptions with determining time of death. It's a big part of my job and really one of the most difficult things that I do.
Is it possible to determine time of death?
From an autopsy, an exact time of death cannot be determined.
Dr. Cruz, during an autopsy where you are looking at gunshot wounds, are you, in general, able to form opinions regarding the distance from which someone was shot?
Yes.
And how do you do that?
So when I am doing my external examination, I'm looking for evidence of close-range discharge of a gun by determining if there's any soot deposition on the skin or if there's any stippling on the skin, which are little pinpoint abrasions that occur from gunpowder that is not completely burned, and it hits the skin with such a force that it causes a little scrape or abrasion. If I see one of those two things, or potentially a muzzle imprint showing that there's been contact with a gun, I can say that the gun was likely fairly close to the skin. In terms of exact distance, I would need to have a test fire of the gun with the ammunition to know for sure, but I can say that it was likely fairly close.
Generally, how does something like clothing interfere with your ability to make a judgment or form an opinion as to the distance from which someone was shot?
Anything that comes in between the gun and the body will preclude that evidence of the close range. So I won't necessarily see any soot. I may not see stippling. I do look at the clothing, but clothing's often quite bloody, and it's difficult to determine.
When you refer to soot and stippling, is there a distance in which you expect to see those type of deposits or those type of injuries on a body?
Yes.
What is that range, or what is that distance?
So soot travels the shortest distance. It's really that completely burned up gunpowder, and it's quite light. If you're looking at soot, you're looking at most likely within inches. For stippling, that unburned gunpowder can travel a bit further. You may be looking at feet, but again, you would need to test fire for sure.
When you talked about the effects that items between the gun and the body have on your ability to determine distance, would that also apply to hair?
Yes.
Specifically, the hair on Jan Jackson's head, would that prevent your ability to determine the distance from which those two shots happened?
Yes, especially due to the color. I didn't see any gunpowder particles, and it would prevent that gunpowder from reaching the scalp and creating stippling.
Similarly, his shirt.
Correct.
Dr. Cruz, did you form an opinion regarding firstly what the cause of death was for Mr. Jackson?
Yes.
And what is that?
Multiple gunshot wounds.
Did you form an opinion as to which of the multiple gunshot wounds specifically caused the death of Mr. Jackson?
Each individually would be fatal on their own.
when you say that each individual shot would be fatal on its own, does that necessarily mean that death would be instantaneous?
No, that does not.
So, just to clarify, is it possible that after sustaining, say, one of the chest wounds, that Mr. Jackson would still be alive?
Yes.
And so saying that each of the gunshots to Mr. Jan Jackson could have caused death, would it be fair to say that none of the gunshots to him were superficial?
Correct. They all injured vital organs.
Dr. Cruz, moving on to the autopsy performed on Melissa Jackson, did you form an opinion as to the cause of death of Melissa Jackson?
Yes.
And what was that opinion? I apologize.
Gunshot wounds of head.
While performing the autopsy of Melissa Jackson, did you also photograph her injuries?
Yes.
And if you would open that book back up and flip to States Exhibits 27 through 36, let me know once you've had a chance to look at those. Are the photos seen in States Exhibits 27 through 36 photographs that were taken of you, by you of Melissa Jackson during her autopsy in June of 2021?
Yes.
And do the photographs depicted in those exhibits fairly and accurately represent the injuries that you observed during that autopsy?
Yes.
Your Honor, the state moves to admit 27 through 36 of States Exhibits.
Mr. Johnson? No additional objections. All right, then States Exhibits 27 through 36 are admitted.
Permission to publish those exhibits, Your Honor.
You may.
Dr. Cruz, looking first at States Exhibit 27, can you tell us what we're looking at in this photograph?
These are tags from the outside of the body bag. On the left is that locking tag with the numbers, and on the right is an identification tag with Mrs. Jackson's name.
And this photograph is taken from the outside of the body bag?
Yes.
Looking next, Dr. Cruz, at States Exhibit 28, can you tell us what we're looking at in this photograph?
This is an identification tag that was found on the body, also bearing Mrs. Jackson's name.
And did the identification tag on Melissa Jackson's body match the identification tag on the outside of the bag?
Yes.
And in States Exhibit 29, can you tell us what we're looking at here?
This is an as-is photograph of Mrs. Jackson as she was received. So the photograph was taken right after the body bag was opened and nothing was moved.
In this photograph, are her hands also inside of the brown paper bags that we saw on Jan Jackson's body?
Yes.
In States Exhibit 30, Dr. Cruz, can you tell us what we are seeing in this photograph?
This is an identification photograph of Mrs. Jackson, so it's a head-on shot of just her face. Here we can also appreciate a number of injuries, including 2 gunshot wounds.
And on the bottom center-ish of the photograph, I'm circling what appears to be an injury.
Yes.
Would you agree that that is an injury?
Yes.
And would you agree that that injury is caused by a gunshot wound?
Yes.
And then an injury at the top center of the photograph to Melissa Jackson's left eye area. Would you agree that that is also a gunshot wound?
Yes.
Are there any other injuries in this photograph from this vantage point that you appreciate or can't appreciate in this photo?
She also has an additional injury in the scalp at the hairline.
Am I pointing at that right now?
Yes.
Kind of center scalp line?
Yes.
In State's Exhibit 31 in State's Exhibit 31, Dr. Cruz, how do you describe this injury in your autopsy report?
In my autopsy report, I describe this as a laceration or a tearing of the scalp.
And when you say or a tearing of the scalp, is a tearing of skin how you define a laceration?
Yes.
Is a laceration different than, or could it be considered what I would describe as a grazing wound from a bullet?
It's definitely possible that that could represent a graze wound from a bullet.
In your opinion, just to be clear, could this laceration be a grazing wound?
Yes.
And when we say a grazing wound, can you explain what we mean by a grazing wound?
A grazing wound is when the bullet makes contact with the skin, but does not truly enter into the body, and it kind of skirts along the surface of that skin.
Looking then, Dr. Cruz, at State's Exhibit 32, can you describe for us what we're seeing in this photograph?
This is a photograph of Mrs. Jackson's left eye. So at the outer edge, so to the right of the photograph as we're looking at it, is a gunshot entrance wound, and it's near the center of that black circle at the edge of her eye.
If I put my cursor in this area, would you agree that my cursor is hovering over the actual entrance wound of that gunshot?
Yes.
Can you explain to us what this dark circle is that surrounds the entrance wound?
That dark circle represents densely deposited soot. So that's soot that came out of the barrel of the gun and then deposited onto that skin. And it's pretty deeply embedded in the skin at this point. Also surrounding that wound, so going to the outer edges of that black circle, mostly toward the bottom edge of it, we see little teeny tiny puncture sort of marks, little red dots. That is stippling. So that's that unburnt gunpowder making contact with the skin and causing an abrasion.
Can you tell us what the embedding of the soot and the stippling shown in this photograph tells you?
They, to me, represent that gun was likely quite close to the surface of the skin, most likely within inches.
Moving on to State's Exhibit 34, can you tell us what we're looking at in this image, Dr. Cruz?
This is the right side of Mrs. Jackson's face, and in the right temple forehead region is a second gunshot entrance wound.
Looking at State's Exhibit 33, is this the same wound shown in 34 from a closer angle?
Yes.
In this photograph, or while you performed your autopsy, did you observe regarding the injury to the right temple any of the same stippling or soot deposits around this injury?
No, I did not. There is some black sort of discoloration you can see at the top area, but really doesn't have that soot-like appearance to it. It's just more so discoloration of the skin that has a darker tone.
And based on the lack of soot and stippling shown in the injury to the right temple area, did you form an opinion regarding the distance from which this injury occurred?
Due to the lack of those findings, I can't say how far away the gun was. I just don't have evidence that it was up really close.
Would you opine that this shot was from further away than the injury to her left eye?
In the absence of anything between the two to stop that, then yes.
And in State's Exhibit 35, can you tell us what we're seeing in this photograph?
So this is the right side of her head, sort of near the top. This is a lacerated wound, so tearing of the skin, but what it represents is a partial exit wound from one of the bullets. So part of the bullet was able to poke through, but much of it also stayed within the head, and that was recovered.
Were you able to tell which of the bullet wounds, whether the left eye or the right temple, had this as the exit path?
Yes, the one to the right eye had this partial exit wound.
And can you tell us, Dr. Cruz, what we are seeing in State's Exhibit 36?
These are the two bullet fragments that were recovered from her body associated with the two gunshot wounds. So here, the one that says right parietal scalp lateral means that that bullet was found in the most outer sort of part of the head, and that was associated with the gunshot wound to the left eye. And the one that says the right parietal scalp medial was associated with the gunshot wound to the right eye temple area, and also associated with that partial exit wound. You can see it's a little smaller.
Can you tell us, Dr. Cruz, what injuries resulted as a result of the gunshot wound to the right side of the face?
To the right side of the face, that bullet entered into the cranial cavity, so there was, again, injury to the skull, that dura, that outer covering, and the brain, and then associated bleeding on top of the brain.
And what about the injuries as a result of the gunshot wound to the left eye?
The gunshot wound to the left eye also injured that skull, the dura, the brain, and then that left eye itself, and had associated bleeding with that.
You mentioned earlier in your testimony that the cause of death related to Melissa Jackson was gunshot wounds of the head, correct?
Correct.
Were you able to establish which gunshot wound specifically was the fatal shot?
No.
Could either of them been fatal?
Yes.
You also then performed an autopsy on Sabrina Jackson, is that correct?
Correct.
And Dr. Cruz, can you tell us whether or not you formed an opinion as to the cause of death for Sabrina Jackson?
Yes, I did.
And what was her cause of death?
Multiple gunshot wounds.
Dr. Cruz, if you can look in that binder one more time for me, please, specifically focusing on Exhibits 37 through 49, and let me know once you've had a chance to review those. Have you had a chance?
Yes.
Dr. Cruz, the photos that you observed in exhibits 37 through 49, were those photographs taken by you during the autopsy of Sabrina Jackson?
Yes.
And the photographs that are depicted in those exhibits, did they fairly and accurately show the images and injuries that you observed during that autopsy?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move to have exhibits 37 through 49 admitted into evidence.
Mr. Johnson?
No additional objections, Your Honor, than what has previously been stated.
All right, then at this time, states exhibits 37 through 49 are admitted.
Permission to publish those exhibits, Your Honor.
You may.
Dr. Cruz, once again, looking at exhibit 37, can you tell us what we're seeing in this photograph?
These are those two items on the outside of the body bag, so that locking tag with the number and the identification tag with Miss Jackson's name.
And in exhibit 38, what are we viewing here?
This is that as-is photograph of Miss Jackson as she was received, so the photo was taken right after that body bag was opened.
And her hands, are they also in brown paper sacks?
Yes.
It would appear to me, Dr. Cruz, that there is an additional piece of material or fabric surrounding Sabrina Jackson in the bag. Can you tell us what that is?
Yes, that is a fitted bed sheet.
And did that arrive inside of the body bag with Sabrina Jackson?
Yes, exactly as it is shown.
Looking then at State's Exhibit 39, is this the tag that was on Sabrina Jackson's body?
Yes.
And were you able, Dr. Cruz, to confirm that the tag on Sabrina Jackson's body matched that of the tag on the body bag?
Yes.
Looking first at Exhibit 40, can you tell us where the injury seen in Exhibit 40 was on the body?
This is on that lateral left side of the torso, like the left sort of flank region.
And can you tell us what injuries were caused from this gunshot wound?
Here, the bullet entered into the abdominal cavity. It first injured the diaphragm, which separates the chest from abdominal cavities. It then injured the stomach and the liver before exiting on the right side of the anterior torso, kind of the front region.
And is State's Exhibit 43 a zoomed-in photograph of that same bullet wound?
Yes.
When looking at the bullet wound in Exhibit 40 and Exhibit 43, did you find any evidence during your autopsy of any soot deposits or stippling?
No.
In State's Exhibit 42, can you tell us where this injury was?
So this injury represents that exit wound on that front side of the abdomen associated with the entrance wound on the left flank.
And State's Exhibit 41, can you tell us what part of the body we're looking at here?
This is the right arm, so it's the anterior portion, meaning if your arms are down and your palms are facing forward, it's that front part.
Was there anything as far as a projectile recovered from either the wound to the abdomen, what I would refer to as the stomach area, the side, or that arm?
There was one projectile recovered, and it was in the arm.
When you wrote your autopsy report, Dr. Cruz, how many different gunshot wounds did you attribute to these three injuries that have been shown in Exhibits 40, 41, 42, and 43?
I counted those as 2 gunshot wounds, so 1 to that abdominal stomach area, and then 1 to the arm.
And was there an additional gunshot wound that you found on Sabrina Jackson's body?
Yes.
Looking at State's Exhibit 44, can you explain to us what we see here?
This is Miss Jackson's left eye, and at the outer edge of that upper eyelid is a gunshot entrance wound.
Can you describe for us the injuries that resulted from this gunshot wound?
This gunshot wound injured the eye, then it injured the skull, dura, and the brain, and caused bleeding onto the brain.
Dr. Cruz, regarding Sabrina Jackson, did you form an opinion regarding the cause of death?
Yes.
And what was that opinion?
Multiple gunshot wounds.
Your Honor, will you darken my screen for 1 second, please? I'm ready to publish. Looking at State's Exhibit 45, Dr. Cruz, can you tell us what we are seeing in this photograph?
This is a photo of Miss Jackson's body after it has been cleaned, and that clothing and the bedsheet have been removed.
In this photograph, are you able, or are we able to see the wound that you labeled in your report as B, the lateral left side of mid-abdomen?
No, it's right on that lateral edge, so you just can't appreciate it from this photograph.
The injury in what could potentially be the chest or upper abdomen of Sabrina Jackson, is this the the wound that you referred to as the exit wound?
Yes.
Dr. Cruz, depending on the position of Sabrina Jackson's body at the time that she sustained the gunshot wounds, is it possible that the left side wound exited the center of her chest and that same bullet then re-entered her arm?
Yes.
So, though you have marked down 3 gunshot wounds, is it possible that only 2 bullets struck her body?
Yes.
Based on the bullet path and the injuries that were sustained in those 3 injuries to the abdomen, my word, not yours, the midsection and the arm, are you able to form an opinion as to whether or not Sabrina Jackson would have been able to roll over after having been shot there?
She definitely could have been able to move.
Looking at State's Exhibit 46, can you tell us what we're seeing in this photograph?
This is Miss Jackson's shirt that she was wearing.
And when you say Miss Jackson, are we referring to Sabrina Jackson?
Sabrina Jackson.
Dr. Cruz, just briefly, there were not photographs taken or similar photographs laid out like this of the clothing worn by Melissa Jackson. Is that because there were no defects to the clothing?
That is correct.
And I'm circling my cursor center of this shirt. There appears to be a little white dot. Is that the defect that you observed on this shirt?
Yes,
And do you attribute that defect to a bullet hole?
I do.
And would that be the exit wound bullet hole that you referred to?
Yes.
State's Exhibit 47, is this that same bullet hole zoomed in?
Yes, it is.
And State's Exhibit 48, can you tell us what we are seeing here?
This is the bullet that was recovered from the soft tissue of the right arm.
And in State's Exhibit 49, what are we seeing?
This is a fragmented bullet that was recovered from the head associated with that gunshot wound to the left eye.
And when you refer to it as fragmented, what does that mean to you?
To me, it means it represents one bullet that had broken into pieces.
Can you describe for us, Dr. Cruz, where on or where in Sabrina Jackson's body this projectile was taken from?
So most of these are tiny fragments that I believe, if I remember correctly, came from bone, but most came from that right parietal region. So actually looking back at Melissa Jackson's injury with that lacerated exit wound and where she also had bullets recovered, I also recovered this fragmented projectile from Sabrina Jackson.
Were you, Dr. Cruz, able to form, I can have the lights back, please. Were you able, Dr. Cruz, to form an opinion regarding the distance from which Sabrina Jackson was shot in her left side?
I did not have any evidence of soot or stippling, so I was not able to determine range of fire.
And again, if there was clothing or bed covers in between the barrel of the gun and her skin, would that affect the ability to find soot and or stippling?
Yes.
Similarly, did you form an opinion regarding the distance from which Sabrina Jackson received the injury to her eye?
Correct.
And did you, in the injury or around the injury to Sabrina Jackson's eye, did you observe any of that soot embedded or stippling?
No, I did not.
Were you able to determine through your autopsy which of the gunshot wounds to Sabrina Jackson actually caused her death?
Similar to the other gunshot wounds, each one is potentially fatal. However, the gunshot wound to her head would have been more rapidly fatal.
When you're doing autopsies, is part of what you do during an autopsy to identify the bodies in which you're examining?
Yes, we say it's the most important thing we do.
And during the autopsy, did you identify the body that was tagged as Jan Jackson to actually be Jan Jackson?
I did.
And the body that was tagged as Melissa Jackson, did you identify or did you identify that body to be Melissa Jackson?
Yes.
And the body that came in that was tagged as Sabrina Jackson, did you also identify that body to actually be Sabrina Jackson?
Yes.
I don't have any further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Johnson, cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Afternoon.
You testified earlier about what you described as stippling and soot deposits on a wound. Remember that?
Yes.
And that to you indicated a certain proximity of the weapon to the injury. Would that be correct?
That's correct.
And with that deposit of that, is there also the possibility that blood or tissue from the person being shot could blow back onto the weapon itself?
Yes, I assume that's possible.
And that even the person who was firing that weapon could possibly get blood or tissue on them, depending on how close the wound was.
That seems reasonable.
So a gun that was within inches of one of these injuries, the muzzle of that gun could potentially have DNA on it from the victim,
Potentially, yes.
as well as the assailant could potentially have DNA on them from the victim,
Potentially, yes.
as well as they could potentially have deposits of gunshot residue on their hands.
Potentially, yes.
And you did note, at least with respect to Melissa Jackson, that you believe that that gun was in close range to her.
Correct.
You also, as part of your job, you do a toxicology analysis as well, don't you?
Correct.
And that's just to make sure that any of the victims didn't have any excessive amounts of any kind of drugs in their body. Is that one of the reasons?
Correct.
And none of the victims in this case had any drugs of abuse in their body, did they?
Correct.
No alcohol, right? No heroin, right?
Correct.
No cocaine, any of that, anything like that.
No, not that was detected, no.
And you are aware of the effects of these drugs that it might have on the human condition, right?
I'm aware they can have effects, and they do affect everyone differently.
And are you aware of the drug fentanyl?
Yes.
And what is fentanyl?
Fentanyl is an opioid, and it is prescribed in a hospital setting, but is now quite common outside of the hospital.
In the hospital setting, what is it used for?
It is used to help with pain, and it's used often in conjunction with sedatives for different procedures.
Is it true that fentanyl is 50 times stronger than heroin?
I'd have to look at the numbers, but it's much stronger, yes.
And it's also 100 times stronger than morphine?
Yes, and as a caveat, morphine is part of heroin.
Okay, thank you for that. And some of the side effects of fentanyl can be extreme euphoria, is that right?
It can have different effects on different people.
And it can also cause confusion.
I suppose someone could get confused.
I mean, but these are some of the indications with that drug that are commonly known, correct?
I assume it's on, I know there's a long list of different side effects of different sort of medications, and I wouldn't argue that that's not part of the list.
But you would agree that it can affect anybody differently?
Correct.
Who, I noticed on the tags of those bodies was the name Alicia Weber. Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury who Alicia Weber is?
So Iowa has 99 counties, and as part of those counties, they have a county medical examiner. Those are physicians that essentially triage cases for us at the state office and determines who needs an autopsy. They also oversee investigators who go to scenes, tag bodies, put bodies in body bags, and Alicia Weber is one of those investigators for Lynn County.
So would it be fair to say that she might go to a crime scene and, I don't know, look at the bodies as they appear at the crime scene?
Correct.
Do you know whether she did that in this case or not?
She had to have been there for that tagging, for tagging all of the bodies and putting them in the body bags. I'm not sure how involved she was, since there, law enforcement and others were there, but she had to have been there for that.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. And then with respect to the autopsy of Jan Jackson, it sounded to me like you have some doubts about how close the weapon might have been to some of those injuries. Is that true?
I don't have evidence of close range, and in those cases, I just don't know, because things can get in the way of soot and stippling for me to know for sure.
Things like bloody clothing, right? I think you said you look at the clothing, but if there's blood on it, you might not see the soot or the stippling, right?
Correct. It may obscure that soot and stippling, and I only look at it with the naked eye.
And Mr. Jackson's hair that you had to shave off on the back of his head, that could have also concealed soot and stippling as well.
With the soot, correct.
Okay. And for those reasons, if the person doing the shooting had been in very close proximity to Mr. Jackson, they again could have got deposits of Mr. Jackson's blood or tissue on themselves.
Yes, yes.
Or the firearm itself could have had that on the muzzle, for example, of the gun.
Yes.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions.
Any redirect, Ms. Slaughter?
Just briefly, Your Honor. Dr. Cruz, Mr. Johnson asked you a line of questioning regarding the effects of fentanyl.
Yes.
Would you agree that there are several factors that go into how fentanyl would affect any specific person?
Correct.
Age,
Correct.
weight?
Weight is possibility.
Any other factors you can think of?
If someone has used it before, it may affect them differently when they use it subsequent times. Your body may metabolize the drug differently. You may have other drugs in your system. Just a long list of why it may affect different people differently.
In your lengthy educational background and training and on-the-job experience, do you have any specific training related to blowback from guns as far as bullet hits body and which directionality blood travels?
No, we do not, and really our experience with that is what we see at autopsy, and most commonly when people shoot themselves.
And when you say most commonly when people shoot themselves, if a bullet is traveling in a direction, most commonly do you see that the blood travels in the same direction as the bullet?
Correct. It can travel in that direction, potentially in the opposite direction, but you're almost guaranteed for it to go in the direction of the bullet and not so much so in the opposite direction.
Would the size and strength of the bullet in the gun, in your opinion, doctor, have an effect on the blood traveling in the opposite direction from the bullet?
In my experience, I have seen that different types of ammunition and different weapons do produce different sorts of patterns of blood spatter and injury.
And so when you say you assume that's possible and that it seems reasonable, are you forming an opinion as to that is what happened in this case or should have happened in this case as far as the blood blowing back towards the gun?
No, not at all.
I don't have any further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Johnson?
But I think I heard you just say that you see it blow back most often when people shoot themselves.
That I'm able to witness whether blowback exists or not with people who shoot themselves, because it's what we commonly see at our office.
Because that weapon would be in close proximity to that injury.
Correct.
All right, and if the blood were to shoot back up in the same direction as the bullet, it's more likely to be deposited on the muzzle of that gun. Is that correct?
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Because the blowback of the blood would shoot back in the direction of the bullet, and somebody was shooting themselves, so they were had to be in close proximity, then the blood would shoot back up have more of an opportunity to shoot back onto the gun.
Correct. With the close proximity, if blood were to shoot back, meaning it doesn't always happen, you should see it.
Should see it on the weapon.
Correct.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions.
Slaughter?
Nothing additional, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Dr. Cruz,
Thank you.
are free to go and may step down. And ladies and gentlemen, this will be a good time, I think, to take our mid-afternoon break. We always give you 15 minutes. We don't always get 15 minutes then because there's always a couple things we do. So I think probably right now I've got about 3:10 on my watch. We're just going to go till 3:30. We'll give you a few minutes longer, and that way we can make sure to get our 15 minutes as well. So I'd remind you of the admonition that I gave you previously, and we'll see you shortly.
All rise.
All right, go ahead and have a seat. There's just one thing I want to clarify for the record. I think pretty easy, but obviously with all of those autopsy photos, you'd already made your objection, Mr. Johnson, but with respect to, I think, the autopsy photos for Melissa Jackson, 27 through 36, you stated something to the effect, other than as stated at the bench. I just want to make it clear there was no additional bench conference related to objections. the objection was made on the record previously and addressed then. So I just wanted, so the record's clear, there was no additional objection made at the bench that's not part of the record. Is that correct, Mr. Johnson?
No, Your Honor, I misspoke there. I just meant the same as the previous two.
And I knew that to be the case, but I just wanted the record to be clear. Then I think we can go off the record at this point. You guys just want to come up with, talk about what's next real quick? See if we can make a record on anything else. So we've got. Okay, that's All right, we're back on the record after our mid-afternoon recess. We have our jurors, counsel, Mr. Jackson present. We had just finished up, I'm sure you recall, with Dr. Cruz. And Ms. Slaughter, the microphone's in front of you, so I'm assuming you're going. Does the state have another witness to call at this point?
State calls Brandon Bozenberg, Your Honor.
All right. Good afternoon, Mr. Bozenberg. I'm going to have you have a seat right over there to my far left, if you would. You can go ahead and have a seat. Will you do me a favor real quick? There's a book underneath the book you just brought up. Would you close that? You can just set it off. You may be asked to look at it, but until you are, let's just keep it closed. Thank you. All right. Mr. Bozenberg, first thing I'm going to do is swear you in. Please raise your right hand. Sir, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you'll be giving today will be the truth?
I do.
All right. And just for the record, can you provide us with your first and last name?
Yes, my name is Brandon Bozenberg.
And could you spell them both, please?
Yes, Brandon is B-R-A-N-D-O-N. Bozenberg is B-O-E-S-E-N-B-E-R-G.
All right. Thank you. Ms. Slaughter?
Thank you, Your Honor. Investigator Bozenberg, how are you currently employed?
I currently work for Collins Aerospace right now.
And how long have you been employed with Collins Aerospace?
Approximately 3 months.
Prior to your employment with Collins, how were you employed?
Before that, I was employed with the Cedar Rapids Police Department.
And what years did you work as a police officer for the Cedar Rapids Police Department?
I worked for the Cedar Rapids Police Department from 2009 to 2022.
Can you tell us just briefly why your employment ended with CRPD?
Yes, I took a medical retirement from the police department.
Investigator Bozenberg, can you tell us a little bit about your educational background?
So I went to the University of Northern Iowa from 2002 to 2006 and graduated with a bachelor's degree in criminology.
And did you then attend the Iowa Law Enforcement Academy?
I did.
And which academy did you attend?
I've actually attended 2 different academies. In 2008, I attended the Iowa Law Enforcement Academy that's located in Des Moines, Iowa, Johnston, Iowa. And then in 2009, I attended the Cedar Rapids Police Department Academy.
Prior to working for the Cedar Rapids Police Department, did you have other law enforcement experience?
Yes, I spent 2.5 years working for the Lynn County Sheriff's Department.
As a deputy sheriff?
Correct.
And then transferred to Cedar Rapids Police Department?
Yes.
Upon transferring to Cedar Rapids Police Department, is that when you had to take some additional courses through the academy for that employment?
Yes.
When you first started your employment with Cedar Rapids Police Department, what position did you hold?
So when I first started the police department, I was a patrol officer.
And how long were you a patrol officer?
I was on patrol from 2009 to 2014.
And in 2014, what about your employment changed?
In 2014, I joined the Criminal Investigative Division as a nighttime investigative officer.
And when you say criminal investigative division, is that sometimes or commonly referred to through CRPD as the CID unit?
Yes.
And you said as a nighttime what?
Night investigator.
Can you tell us what a night investigator does working as part of the CID?
Yep. So it was part of a unit that we called the MAT unit. It's called Mobile Assist Team. It was a plainclothes investigative unit. So our duties were to investigate any crimes that would happen at night that didn't rise to the occasion of calling in the crime scene unit. So we would process crime scenes. We would do investigations, mainly that happened at night.
When you were part of the MAT team, tell us how you would become involved in different investigations.
So frequently, as patrol officers would get sent to calls and they realized that an investigator was needed to follow up with the case, that's when the our unit would get called to come in and finish the investigation.
Now, you said that you would participate as part of the MAT team in investigations that did not rise to the level of needing the crime scene unit to come in. Is that correct?
Correct.
Where is that line drawn where it's something that the MAT team or the mobile assist team can handle versus bringing in the crime scene unit?
One of the clear lines was homicides. As a MAT investigator, we wouldn't investigate homicides, but we would investigate assaults, serious assaults, narcotics, crimes. If a homicide happened, then the crime scene unit would come in and handle that.
So you possibly would do a shooting as long as it didn't result in a death,
Yes.
or a stabbing as long as it didn't result in a death.
Yes.
And you said also narcotics, so drug deal type of investigations.
Yes.
How does a police officer come to be a part of this mobile assist team?
There's a competitive application process. As a position opens up on like an investigative unit, they'll open it up to the department, and anybody that wants to be a part of that unit will apply and go through an application interview process and then get selected on an interview panel.
Once you are selected and chosen to be part of this mobile assist team, are you then equipped with additional training, specialized training that assists you in doing the jobs that come with that?
There's, so once you're part of investigations, even as a patrol officer, me specifically, I've attended numerous different trainings and classes and seminars over the years. And so when you become a part of the investigative unit, you take classes that are tailored towards investigations. So throughout my years as an investigator, I went to multiple different classes throughout those years.
Without going into specific details about each of these trainings, can you give us an idea or a couple of examples of the types of training that you would receive in addition to basic training that would be necessary for your job as an investigator?
Sure. So so I've been to a few different interview technique classes. I went to a 2-week homicide class, various different classes that cover a lot of different aspects of investigations. I went to a handful of narcotics-related investigation classes. Then later on, I attended some other more specialty schools.
And what type of specialty schools did you attend?
So later on, I became a member of the crime scene unit, and I attended a week-long photography school. I went to a week-long crime scene investigation school, and also attended a latent print examination, which is technically called the Science of Friction Ridge Detail class.
Science and Friction Ridge Detail?
Sorry, yeah, the Science of Friction Ridge Detail.
Is that fingerprinting?
Yes.
And when you reference latent, does that just mean a fingerprint?
Yes, latent usually refers to something that's not visibly seen right away, kind of like an unknown print. So when we refer to latent print, it's one that hasn't been completely developed into a print that we can visibly see.
You said that you took specialized or went to a specialized training school on photography. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us why, as a part of the crime scene unit, that photography is important?
Sure. Photography is very important with crime scenes. During any type of crime scene, we only get one chance to fully document that crime scene. And one of the best ways to do that is through photography. Because photographs are good indefinitely. So once we take those, it properly documents how we saw the scene and different aspects of the scene. So we can refer to those later and be able to present what we saw to others as well.
When you transitioned from the mobile assist team into the crime scene unit, what year was that?
Well, so in between those two units, in 2017, I actually became a member of the narcotics investigative team. And so from 2017 to January of 2020, I was with narcotics, and then in January of 2020, I joined the crime scene unit.
What did you do when you were with the narcotics unit?
Narcotics was all about investigating narcotics crimes, so we would just run a lot of different narcotics investigations.
And then to get onto the crime scene unit or into the crime scene unit, can you tell us what that application process looked like?
Yeah, very similar to each process that I've been through in the investigative unit. There's an application process and an interview process that I went through to get selected for that position.
So in one capacity or another, would it be fair to say, Investigator Bozenberg, that you were an investigator in one capacity or another from 2014 through 2022 when you retired?
Yes.
Other than MAT team, narcotics, and the crime scene unit, were you a part of any other investigative units?
No.
How, if at all, does the crime scene unit differ from that of the mobile assist team?
So the crime scene unit is mainly designed to investigate crime scenes and do evidence processing at the station. Whereas on the MAT unit, if we weren't investigating a crime scene, we were just proactive officers in plainclothes and plain cars out doing kind of like a hybrid patrol function as an investigator. But as a crime scene unit investigator, our sole job is just investigating crime scenes and processing evidence from crime scenes.
How do you come to be involved in a case that requires members of the crime scene unit to show up?
There's a few different paths to getting involved. All kind of depends on what we're doing. A lot of times, if a big event happens, commanders that will be on patrol will either notify commanders in the investigative division, and then that filters down to the resources that are needed to handle a case. So in bigger cases, we're usually notified through our commander. Other times, we all have police radio, so we would be listening to the radio frequently, and we might hear an incident come out over the radio that we might understand to know that needs a crime scene unit investigator.
When you either get sent or hear a call and are going to respond to a crime scene, do you have a kit or something? Are there certain instruments that you take with you to every crime scene?
Yes, so as a crime scene investigator, we all have our own vehicles that are outfitted with all the tools that we need to process a crime scene. A lot of like personal protective equipment for crime scenes. There's items to process for latent prints, evidence collection. We have a lot of different assortment of tools to process a crime scene that are all within our vehicle. So when we do get a call, we don't have to load up every time we get called. We just have that all readily available in our vehicle and respond to a scene.
Investigator Bozenberg, were you a member of the crime scene unit on June 15th of 2021?
Yes, I was.
Did you become involved into homicide investigation taking place at 4414 Oak Leaf Court Northeast?
Yes.
Can you recall specifically regarding that case how you came to be involved?
That morning at the time, Lieutenant Fitzpatrick was our commander in charge of the crime scene unit, and he had received notification that there was an incident in progress at 4414 Oak Leaf Court, and so we turned on our radios to monitor the radio traffic that was as the incident was unfolding.
When you got the call about that incident, as you call it, what information were you provided prior to heading in that direction?
At first, there wasn't a whole lot of information that was coming out, but I did hear that there was a male subject going to the hospital with a gunshot wound. So that was my first task, was to go to the hospital.
And can you recall what hospital you went to?
St. Luke's, I believe.
When you got to St. Luke's Hospital, did you make contact with Alexander Jackson?
Yes, I did.
And is Alexander Jackson in this courtroom today?
Yes, he is.
Can you point him out, describe an article of clothing he's wearing, please?
Yes, he's sitting over at that table on the left in a suit.
White shirt,
Yes, white shirt.
goatee?
Yes.
Your Honor, if the record could reflect that this witness identified the defendant.
The record so reflects.
Investigator Bozenberg, when you made contact with the defendant at the hospital, can you tell us where he was?
So I actually arrived at the hospital before he did. So when I was at the hospital, the ambulance brought him in and put him into a emergency room, and then that's where I had contact with him at.
When you made contact with him, did he appear to be injured?
Yes.
And what part of his body did you observe injuries on?
He had an injury to his left foot.
What type of injury did you observe to his foot?
A gunshot wound.
Investigator Bozenberg, when you made contact with the defendant, did you take photographs of the injury to his left foot?
I did.
And would you open up that white binder for me and flip to State's Exhibit 149, 150, 151, please?
Okay.
And do you recognize the photos?
I do.
Are they photos that you took?
Yes.
And are they photos that you took of the defendant's gunshot wound to his left foot?
Yes.
Those photos fairly and accurately depict the injury that you saw on the defendant on June 15th of 2021?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move to admit Exhibits 149, 150, and 151.
Mr. Johnson, any objection? No, Your Honor. All right, then at this time, defendants' exhibits 149, 150, and 151 are admitted. Do you wish to publish these?
I do, Your Honor.
All right, let me hit the right buttons here.
Investigator Bozenberg, looking first at State's Exhibit 149, can you tell us what we're seeing in this photograph?
Yes, this is a picture of the bottom side of his left foot.
And in this photograph, are you able to see an injury?
Yes.
Is there a laser pointer up there?
Yes.
Will you point at using the big screen, the injury that we need to be seeing?
Yes. So in this photo, the injury is right there.
And is that an exit wound?
Yes.
In this photograph, is the defendant laying in a hospital bed?
He is.
Looking next at State's Exhibit 150, can you tell us what we're seeing in this photograph?
This is the top of his left foot and the injury to the top of his left foot.
And can you just point at the injury that we should be seeing?
Right here in the center.
And looking at State's Exhibit 151, what is depicted in this photograph?
This is the same injury that we saw in the last photo, just a different angle and a little closer.
And you're using a ruler in this photograph, is that correct?
That is correct.
Can you tell us why you use that ruler?
Just for documentation purposes, just to accurately show the size. Sometimes when you take photos, your perspective can kind of get off, so we put a ruler there to show the perspective and distance.
Did you have an opportunity to conduct some sort of an examination on the rest of the defendant's body?
I did. I looked at his hands and his arms and his legs.
And on his hands, arms, and legs, did you find blood?
Yes.
Did you find any injury on the hands, arms, or legs associated with the blood you found?
No, not that I saw.
How would you define the term defensive wounds?
I suppose defensive wounds could be defined as any wounds that you might sustain while you're in a defensive position. Generically speaking, we might see defensive wounds like on the backside of the hands or forearms as you're kind of shielding your body, or maybe on the outside of your legs if you're in a more of a fetal position, shielding your body.
Did you see anything on the defendant's body during your overview exam of him that would indicate any type of defensive wounds?
No.
Other than the gunshot wound injury to the top of the defendant's left foot, was there anything that you observed on his body, any other injuries?
No.
When you left the hospital, where did you go next?
So after I left the hospital, I went to 4414 Oakleaf Court.
And what was the purpose of going to that address?
That was to start processing the scene, as officers had found 3 decedents at the house.
Were you the only crime scene unit evidence processor that was assigned to this case?
No, I was not.
Who else was assigned with you?
Along with myself, Investigator Jessica Harden was also the crime scene unit investigator assisting me.
Is it customary or typical that more than one evidence processor or investigator would be assigned to process a crime scene?
Yes.
Is there a reason for that?
Yes, a lot of times homicide scenes require a lot of work by a crime scene unit investigator. So when there's 2 or 3 or 4 crime scene investigators there, it makes the process a little faster because we can split the jobs. We have 2 people to go through the work. As a sole investigator doing a homicide, it would significantly increase the amount of time it took to process the scene.
In general, when you approach a crime scene, is there a specific process or protocol that is used or followed in every crime scene?
Yeah, so the process is generically the same with every like homicide scene or crime scene. Some of the intricate details change based on the circumstances of the case, but the overall process is typically the same.
Can you describe that overall process to us?
Sure. So when we enter a crime scene, our main job is to document the crime scene, collect and preserve any evidence that we might find at a crime scene. So one of our very first jobs is to take photographs we take photographs as we have found it to kind of show how the scene was before we start doing work. So, one of the first steps is to take overall photographs of everything. Once we have overall photographs, we'll kind of decide what needs to be done next. A lot of times it's marking obvious items of evidence that are in plain view. Again, then we'll take another set of photographs to show where that evidence was kind of in relation to our overall photographs. And as we kind of do that, it's kind of like peeling back layers of an onion. Once we do that, we'll also, we have additional documentation procedures that we do with a ferro laser scanner. So we'll take laser scans of a scene, and then after photos and laser scans are done of marked evidence, we'll kind of remove that first layer of evidence that we find, and then we'll kind of dig a little deeper to see if we can find another layer of evidence, and we'll kind of keep repeating that process until we've processed the whole crime scene.
Generally, when you start processing a crime scene in a house like this one, do you start exterior and work your way interior, or do you go interior and work your way out?
At a scene like this, we would first start by taking exterior overall photographs.
And can you describe for us Can you describe for us what your initial observations of the 4414 Oakleaf Court Northeast address were upon arrival?
There wasn't a whole lot of initial observations. It was there was really not a whole lot to view from the outside. It was what you would expect of any neighborhood that you would go into. So there's no obvious outward signs. Just appeared normal, minus our police activity that was there.
And did you, in fact, take photos of the exterior of the home?
Yes, photos were taken of the exterior.
Investigator Bozenberg, will you flip in that book and just briefly glance at States Exhibits 50 through 59?
Okay.
Do you recognize those photographs?
Yes.
Are they photographs taken of the exterior of the 4414 Oakleaf Court Northeast?
They are.
And are these photographs, do they fairly and accurately depict how you found that scene on June 15th of 2021?
They do.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move to admit Exhibits 50 through 59.
Any objection? No, Your Honor. All right. I'm assuming you'd like to publish?
I would, Your Honor.
All right. These should be coming up.
Investigator Bozenberg, looking first at State's Exhibit 50, can you tell us what we're seeing in this photograph?
Yes, this is, so you see the garage doors on the right side. The front entrance of the house is on kind of more of the left side of the house that we're looking at. So this is from the intersection of Oakleaf Court and Scarlet Oak Court, looking at what I would describe as the southwest corner of the house.
And what about State's Exhibit 51?
So this is the front of the residence that faces Oakleaf Court. So we're looking at the main door there, more on the left side of the photograph.
State's Exhibit 52, as we zoom in, is this the front door of that same residence?
Yes, it is.
And in the photo, do you see a camera?
Yes.
Zooming in on State's 53, is that a zoomed in photo of the camera?
Yes, it is.
And do you recall, or if you can tell from this photograph, what type of camera system that was?
Yes, it was a Ring brand camera.
Looking at State's Exhibit 54, can you tell us what we're seeing in this photograph?
Yep. So this photo is moved to the opposite side of the house. Now, this is the back side of the house, opposite of the front door. So we're looking at what I would describe as the east side of the house, even though it doesn't sit perfectly on a north, south, west, east grid.
Investigator Bozenberg, using the laser pointer, I just want you to point out a couple of things for us from this angle. Can you point out the rear entry door from this angle?
Sure. So right down the center, you have this large stack. The entry door is right here on the bottom.
And can you point out to us what windows would be associated with Sabrina Jackson's bedroom?
Yes, so Sabrina Jackson's bedroom would be the very far right side on the bottom.
Alexander Jackson's bedroom windows?
His are going to be just to the left of Sabrina's, underneath that porch right here.
And what about the master bedroom shared by Jan and Melissa Jackson?
So the master bedroom, you're going to have, they have a door right here, and that's the windows door to the master bedroom.
In State's Exhibit 55, what are we viewing here?
This is a kind of a closer up and a different angle of that master bedroom porch.
In this photograph, do you see another camera?
Yes.
And can you point that camera out for us?
Yeah, this camera, from our perspective, is on the right side of the railing. Right here.
And looking at State's Exhibit 56, is this a zoomed-in photograph of a camera?
Yes.
Is this the same camera that you just pointed out to us from Exhibit 55?
Yes.
And is this also a Ring brand camera?
Yes.
Looking at State's Exhibit 57, can you tell us what we're seeing in this photograph?
Yep. Now, this is the garage doors that would face what I would describe as south. Yes. Yep.
And Exhibit 58, is this what is in Exhibit 58?
So this is kind of trying to show the location of another camera that's located above the light on the garage door to the right. So the camera sits right above that light right there.
And is Exhibit 59 a zoomed-in photograph of the camera that sits on the garage door side of the house?
Yes.
Is that also a Ring brand doorbell camera?
Yes.
Once the exterior of the home is photographed, did you go inside?
Yes.
When you went inside of the home, did you conduct or complete a walkthrough?
Yes, I did.
Can you explain to us what a walkthrough is?
So this walkthrough was kind of done in conjunction. It was, once I arrived there, we had a couple commanders that were also arriving on scene. So we all took a walkthrough. Investigator Harden had already been at the scene. So the walkthrough is kind of a chance to kind of get oriented with our scene. Having seen it for the first time, we take a brief walkthrough. We're not really doing any processing work. We're just walking through, kind of taking a tour, trying to figure out the layout of the house, where evidence might be, where the decedents are located, just trying to familiarize ourselves and gather some information on how we might proceed forward.
When you are processing a scene that is a death investigation or a homicide investigation, does a local medical examiner come to the scene?
Yes.
Did a local medical examiner come to the scene in this case?
Yes.
Can you recall her name?
Yes, this was medical examiner Alicia Weber.
When the medical examiner showed up, well, generally, when a medical examiner shows up at the scene, what's the purpose of them being there?
So the medical examiner, they are kind of our liaison between the decedents and the state medical examiner's office for getting an autopsy. They will conduct their own brief report on the decedents and some information about the decedents. And so ultimately, they're the ones that will come make arrangements to remove the decedents and make arrangements to get them to medical,
And did Alicia Weber come to the scene in this incident?
Yes.
And when she got there, what did she do?
So she was there twice. She came earlier on in the first day after our first walkthrough. So we went through and showed her where all the decedents were. She did a brief examination of the bodies to see, the commanders wanted to know if she could approximate a time of death. And so she walked through the scene and kind of just gathered some initial information for her reports.
And then she left?
Correct.
When she left the first time, did she leave the decedents or the bodies in the location that was their final resting place?
Yes.
Once Ms. Weber left, what happened next?
Once she left, that's when we kind of began our crime scene processing. Additional photographs were taken, done some exterior photographs. Some Investigator Harden had started taking some interior photographs. While she was doing that, I utilized the Faro 3D laser scanner and started documenting the exterior of the scene with the laser scanner.
Can you tell us what a Faro 3D laser scanner is?
Sure. So Faro is actually the company that we use. There's a handful of companies that create a laser scanner. It's kind of like a machine that we put on a tripod. And what it does is it has a laser, and since the speed of light is a known value, it shoots out a laser, and it measures the time it takes for that laser to bounce off, let's say, another wall and return to that laser scanner. And so once it has that measurement, it'll move just slightly down and take another measurement, and it'll spin around this way and then also like on its axis. And so one laser scan that we do takes millions of different data points of measurements. And so what happens is let me back up a little bit. After we take all those laser measurements, inside of the laser scanner is also a camera. So it'll take laser measurements, and then it'll spin around and take photographs. And then later what we do is we take all of the laser point data and photographs, and we stitch them all together, and we create a 3D rendition or a 3D model of the crime scene. So we can kind of see the crime scene in a 3D world, which allows us to better preserve the crime scene and just better document what we're seeing. And then it also allows us to take measurements of anything we might want to later.
Now, when you say that you take this laser data and this photographic data and stitch it together, is that something that's done through a program associated with this Faro scanner?
Yes.
So essentially you're inputting information and this scanner spits out images.
Yeah, so we'll put in all the data. The program will stitch all the data together, and then it allows us to view that stitched together data.
Did you do Faro scanning of the exterior and the interior of this home?
I did.
And in this specific case, did the laser data and the photographic data for both the interior and the exterior get stitched together?
Yes, it did.
And once it was stitched together, were you able to use software to create what I refer to as fly-throughs?
Yes.
Essentially a motion picture type of effect that shows an area. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And that was done for the interior and the exterior?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would offer for admission Exhibit 60, the interior and exterior Faro scans, fly-throughs.
Any objection? All right, then at this time, State Exhibit 60 is admitted.
May I have permission to publish that, Your Honor?
You may.
Just to make a brief record, Your Honor, contained within Disc 60 are two different clips. One clip of the exterior of the crime scene labeled 60A, one clip of the interior of the crime scene labeled 60B, and I'm going to play 60A first. Can you dim the lights, please?
Absolutely. I'm going to clear the big screen. Let me know when you think you're ready. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to stand and stretch for a second, feel free to do so. Just make sure you stay in your spots. Ms. Slaughter, just in the light of the time of the day, maybe it'd be appropriate just to, I don't know if you can skip around and then we can address this and start with that tomorrow, but.
I'm just going to play it. I don't think it's going to get any better than this, Judge.
All right. We'll go with what we've got. Here you go, ladies and gentlemen.
Investigator Bozenberg, as we watched that fly-through, there were some areas of the image that appeared to be maybe see-through or something of that nature. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you explain why that is?
Yes, sure. So,
Will you leave those off, please?
no, sorry. The fly-through, when I created the fly-through, it was done at an elevated angle, but obviously the laser scanner, we didn't put up that high in the air. So when the laser scanner's on the ground, it's much like a camera. Whatever the laser scanner can see from its current vantage point is what's captured. So like a lot of times there might be a roof line that wasn't there or some walls behind like a tree. Since the laser scanner couldn't see that in its various positions as we moved it around the house, that actual data of like that roof line wasn't captured. So it's actually capturing the data from underneath it that we had taken inside the house. So that's why you might see like an open roof line or a section of a wall missing.
Thank you. And I'm going to play 60B, Your Honor.
Yes.
Is that part of the imaging system?
Yes, that's some equipment that comes along with this Faro laser scanner.
In the Faro scan, there were some parts of the images where it was apparent that there were some evidence markers set. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you firstly tell us what an evidence marker is?
Sure. So an evidence marker, as we saw at the beginning of the indoor one, they're just a yellow piece of plastic with different numbers on them that we use to denote various items of evidence.
Were additional evidence markers used after the scans were completed?
Yes.
Is there a reason for that, why some are done up front and some are done later?
Yes, so kind of as I was explaining earlier, so what we did is after overall photographs were taken, we went and marked all the obvious pieces of evidence, and then once all the obvious pieces of evidence were done, we brought the scanner in to scan it. Additional items of evidence were marked later, but at that point the priority was kind of capturing what we could see with our naked eye without disturbing any of the scene, and then also we needed to capture the data from the decedents so we could start that process of get them to the medical examiner's office.
Overall, how many days was this house process?
Total, we were there on 4 different days.
Generally, when there is a crime scene, is the crime scene held or processed for 4 days?
No.
What, if any, factors contributed to how many days or the length that this crime scene was processed?
Yeah, so on this one, just the number, having 3 decedents in the house was definitely a factor, and having them on all in different areas added to the time it took to process this scene.
I don't know what Your Honor's position is, but for my line of question, this might be a good place to break.
We're close enough. So, ladies and gentlemen, I guess with that, we will, and just so you can rest assured, I talked to the attorneys earlier, we're still on schedule. So, so with that, we'll let you go for the night. I would remind you again of the admonition, again, just before we break for a longer period of time. I'm going to hit the high points again. Again, keep an open mind. Don't come to any decisions in this case yet. Do not do any sort of investigation. Do not communicate with anybody about this case or let anybody communicate with you. And again, avoid all media related to this case as long as you're a juror. So with that, have a good evening, everybody. And we'll be ready to go by 9 o'clock tomorrow.
All rise.
Mr. Bozenberg, you can step down and you're free to go for today. I believe you're needed back here at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
All right, thank you.
Go ahead and have a seat, everybody. Just before we all adjourn for the day, just checking, is there anything we need to address on the record from the state's end?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Johnson? All right, then we'll call it a day for ourselves as well. I think there may be a couple things to take up tomorrow morning, so 8:45 or so, be here ready and we can make a record. I think Mr. Johnson wanted to talk about the video sometime.
The interview video.
Yes, I believe so. Yep. And
Is there anything else we were taking up tomorrow morning?
Is there anything we need to do on the record about the YouTube video?
I think we talked about the video. I mean, we made a record on the video before lunch. I came back. I mean, I guess I agreed with the defense that parts of it really had nothing to do with what, it was supposedly demonstrative of. My understanding is, I think that was on the record, you had no objection with the edits as far as the time that were made, and your only remaining objection was just the voice over. Is that correct, Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
All right. Yep.
Yes, Your Honor, thank you.
Okay.
I did review the photos before Mr. Bozenberg took the stand, and I did tell the prosecution my only objection was to photo 102,
Okay.
and it's for the same reason as I was objecting to the autopsy photos. And so I was just wanting to make that record here, speaking things along.
All right. Go ahead.
I don't know, it's up on my computer screen if you want to see it, to know which photo we're talking about.
I could just look at the book. I'll do that and, make a very quick record on it in the morning.
Okay.
And the only other thing is just at some point I am going to need the state to submit electronically the map as 160, and then we'll need to add a copy, make sure we have a copy up here marked as 160 to go back to the jury. So,
I'll do it.
All right.
Go downstairs.
All right, then we'll let Kathy conclude the record. And you're going to take that with you? All right.
You don't want to hold it for us?
I do not.
Literally played it 50 times, 70 times. I don't think it's the scanner, I think it's my computer. The one in my office works fine. Does it? Yes. Okay.
far as nothing else is happening in here.